They kicked me out just for marrying a black man. But 25 years later, our son did something incredible. He saved their lives. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Dr. Michael Johnson squinted at the cardiac monitor as the numbers blurred before his exhausted eyes. 36 hours into his shift, the fluorescent lights of the emergency department seemed unnaturally harsh, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes. He rubbed his face vigorously, trying to force alertness back into his system. "You look like hell, Johnson," remarked Nurse Claire, sliding a fresh chart across the counter. "Your relief should be here in 20 minutes. Think you can make it that long without falling face first onto a patient?" Michael managed a tired smile. "I've made it this far, haven't I? What's 20 more minutes?" The answer came in the form of blaring sirens growing steadily louder outside the emergency entrance. Both Michael and Claire turned toward the sound, their bodies tensing with the practiced reflex of emergency medical staff. "So much for a quiet end to your shift," Claire muttered, already moving toward the ambulance bay. The emergency doors burst open as paramedics wheeled in 2 gurneys in rapid succession. Michael's exhaustion evaporated instantly, adrenaline flooding his system as he assessed the scene before him. "What do we have?" he demanded, falling into step beside the first gurney. "Elderly couple, head-on collision with a truck. Male, approximately 75, severe internal bleeding, BP dropping rapidly. Female, same age, significant head trauma with possible intracranial pressure," the paramedic rattled off. They were trapped in the vehicle for almost 40 minutes before extraction. Michael nodded, his mind already cataloging necessary procedures. "Get them into Trauma 1 and 2. I need complete panels, type and cross for 4 units each, and page Dr. Reynolds for neurosurgery consult on the female patient." As the trauma team mobilized around them, Claire appeared at Michael's side, concern etched on her face. "Michael, you've been on for 36 hours. Maybe we should wait for Dr. Patel. He'll be here any minute." Michael was already pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. "No time. Look at his pressure. He's bottoming out. If we wait, we lose him." He moved quickly to the elderly man's bedside, where the monitor showed dangerously low blood pressure. "Let's move." The next few minutes were a blur of organized chaos as Michael examined the elderly man, finding distended abdomen, mottled skin, and all the telltale signs of internal hemorrhaging. "He's bleeding out. We need to get him to OR now." In the adjacent trauma room, the neurosurgeon Dr. Reynolds had arrived and was examining the elderly woman. Pupils unequal and sluggish to respond, definite signs of elevated intracranial pressure. "We need to relieve it immediately." Michael glanced between both patients, making split-second decisions. "Claire, call up to OR and tell them we're bringing 2 critical patients. Dr. Reynolds will take the woman, and I'll handle the internal bleeding on the man." Claire hesitated. "Dr. Johnson, protocol states—" "I know what protocol states." Michael cut her off, his voice firm but not unkind. "But if we wait for Dr. Patel to get briefed and scrubbed in, this man dies. There's no time." The urgency in his voice ended the discussion. Within minutes, both patients were being rushed toward separate operating rooms. In OR 1, Michael worked methodically to locate the source of bleeding. His hands moved with practiced precision, despite his exhaustion. The monitor beeped ominously as the patient's heart rate began to climb dangerously. Come on," Michael muttered, his eyes scanning the abdominal cavity. "There you are." He identified a tear in the mesenteric artery, blood pulsing out with each heartbeat. "Suction here. I need 3-nil silk." As he worked to control the bleeding, the cardiac monitor suddenly wailed in alarm. "VTOC! Pressure's dropping!" Michael didn't look up from his work. "Push 1 of epi. Stay with me, sir. Stay with me." His fingers moved deftly, suturing the damaged vessel. I've almost got it controlled. Just hang on." Across the hall in OR2, Dr. Reynolds was performing a craniotomy to relieve the pressure on the woman's brain. Both surgical teams worked feverishly, fighting against time and probability. After nearly 3 hours of surgery, Michael finally stepped back from the table, his surgical gown soaked with sweat beneath his PPE. "I think we've got all the bleeds. Let's close and get him to ICU for monitoring." The patient had stabilized, his vitals slowly returning to safer ranges. Michael exhaled deeply, feeling the crash that always came after such intense focus. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him even more exhausted than before. Later that evening, Michael sat alone in the doctor's lounge, completing his post-operative notes. His shift had officially ended 6 hours ago, but the emergency surgeries had extended his already marathon workday. His eyes burned from fatigue, and his handwriting had deteriorated to nearly illegible scrawls. The door opened and Claire entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one in front of Michael without a word. "Thanks," he mumbled, taking a grateful sip. "How are they doing?" "Stable for now. Both in ICU. Dr. Reynolds got the intracranial pressure under control, but we won't know about brain function until the woman regains consciousness." Claire paused, then added, "I thought you might want to know who you saved today." She slid 2 plastic bags across the table, personal effects collected from the patients. On top of each was an ID card. Michael glanced down and read the names aloud. Harold and Judith Thompson. Something in his brain clicked, a distant memory of those names, spoken rarely but with unmistakable emotion by his mother. He felt the blood drain from his face. Claire frowned, noticing his sudden pallor. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Michael stared at the IDs, unable to believe the coincidence. He reached into one of the bags and pulled out a wallet, opening it to reveal a small photograph tucked behind a credit card. The woman in the photo was unmistakable. He'd seen her face in the single photograph his mother had kept all these years. "These people," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think they're my grandparents." "What?" Claire leaned closer, confusion evident on her face. "How is that possible?" "My mother's parents," Michael explained, his hands now trembling slightly. "They cut her off completely when she married my father. I've never met them, never even seen them except in one old photo my mom kept. But she mentioned their names once or twice, Harold and Judith Thompson." "Are you sure it's them?" "Thompson is a common name." Michael checked the address on the driver's license, then pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. "This is the same town my mom said they lived in." He scrolled through his phone, then looked back at the photo in the wallet. "It has to be them." Claire placed a hand on his shoulder. "What are you going to do?" Michael stared at his phone for a long moment before pressing his mother's number. It was nearly midnight, but this couldn't wait. The phone rang several times before a groggy voice answered. "Michael, is everything okay?" His mother's voice was thick with sleep. "Mom, I'm sorry to wake you," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Something's happened. I'm at the hospital." "Are you hurt?" Alarm sharpened her tone instantly. No, I'm fine. It's about a case I had today." Michael took a deep breath. "Mom, there was an accident. A couple came in, badly injured. I operated on them." "Michael, what is it? You're scaring me." He closed his eyes, hardly believing what he was about to say. "Mom, I think I just saved the lives of your parents." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what seemed like an eternity. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was so quiet Michael had to strain to hear her. "Are you certain it's them? Same names, same hometown, same faces from the photo you kept?" "It's them, Mom." Another long pause, and then the silence was broken by a single question, charged with decades of emotion. "Do they know who you are?" "No, they're still unconscious." Nobody knows who I am," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. The revelation hung in the air between mother and son, a shared secret neither had anticipated facing. 3 hours later, Michael stood in the hospital lobby, watching as his mother's blue sedan pulled into the parking lot. Even from a distance, he could see Emma's stiff posture behind the wheel, the way she sat motionless for several moments after parking. Her face, when she finally emerged from the car, was pale as moonlight, a stark contrast to her bright red coat, the one she always wore when she needed courage. Michael met her at the entrance, unsure whether to hug her or maintain professional distance in his workplace. Emma solved the dilemma by pulling him into a tight embrace, her body trembling slightly against his. "Are you absolutely certain it's them?" she whispered, pulling back to search his face. "Come see for yourself," Michael answered, leading her through the maze of corridors toward the ICU. In a small consultation room adjacent to the intensive care unit, Michael spread out the documents recovered from the accident. "Address, date of birth, everything matches what you told me about them." He hesitated before sliding the wallet across the table. "And there's this." Emma's hand shook as she lifted the wallet, her breath catching as she saw the photograph inside. "That's my mother," she confirmed, her voice barely audible. 25 years without a word from them, and now—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Michael watched his mother's face cycle through a complex series of emotions: shock, grief, anger, and something else he couldn't quite name. Perhaps longing. "Would you like to see them? They're both still sedated but stable." Before Emma could answer, the door opened, and Claire appeared, her expression urgent. "Dr. Johnson, your male patient is showing complications, blood pressure dropping, and the monitors are indicating possible secondary bleeding." Michael was instantly alert, the doctor in him overriding all personal connections. "I need to go," he told his mother. "You can wait here, or—" "I'll come with you," Emma said firmly. "I want to see them." Minutes later, Michael was reviewing Harold Thompson's vitals outside the ICU room. Through the glass, Emma stood motionless, staring at the unconscious man whose decision had shaped her entire adult life. "Looks like a small secondary bleed, not as severe as the first, but concerning," Michael murmured to Claire, already reaching for a surgical mask. "We need to intervene now." Inside the ICU room, Michael worked methodically, ordering additional blood units and medications while examining the surgical site. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, temporarily sealing the new leak until they could determine if a return to surgery was necessary. Throughout the procedure, he felt the weight of his mother's gaze through the glass partition. He knew she wasn't seeing a doctor saving a patient. She was seeing her son trying to save the father who had disowned her. The irony wasn't lost on him. After stabilizing Harold, Michael stepped out to find Emma now standing beside Judith's bed in the adjacent room, her hand hovering inches above her mother's, not quite touching. "They look so much older than I remember," Emma said as Michael approached. "I've been carrying an image of them frozen in time." Before Michael could respond, a stern voice called from down the corridor. "Dr. Johnson, a word, please." Dr. Simmons, the department chief, stood with arms crossed, his expression thunderous. Michael excused himself and followed his superior to a quiet corner. "Johnson, I just reviewed the admission records. You performed emergency surgery on patients who are apparently your relatives." Simmons didn't phrase it as a question. Michael straightened his shoulders. "I didn't know they were my grandparents when they arrived. I've never met them before in my life." "But you continued treating them after you made the identification," Simmons countered, his voice low but sharp. "You know that violates hospital protocol. You should have recused yourself immediately." "We were in the middle of a crisis situation," Michael defended. "Harold Thompson was experiencing secondary bleeding. There wasn't time. There's always another physician," Simmons cut him off firmly. "Always. This could legally compromise the hospital. I'm removing you from their cases effective immediately." Michael wanted to argue further, but knew it would be futile. Hospital ethics guidelines were clear about treating family members, particularly in high-risk situations. "I understand," he conceded, frustration evident in his voice. "Dr. Patel will take over. Brief him fully, then stay away from their cases." "I mean it, Johnson." With that, Simmons strode away, leaving Michael seething with professional embarrassment and personal concern. When Michael returned to the ICU, he found his mother engaged in conversation with an elderly nurse he didn't recognize. The nurse, her name tag identified her as Martha, was speaking with the familiarity of an old acquaintance. "My dear, your mother asks about you every year on your birthday," Martha was saying, her weathered hand patting Emma's arm. "She never stopped thinking about you, not for a single day." Emma looked stunned. "But my father, Harold forbade any contact, that's true." Martha nodded sadly. "But Judith kept photos of you hidden all these years. She showed them to me sometimes when Harold wasn't around. Pictures of you, and later clippings from the college newspaper when Michael graduated medical school." "She knew about Michael," Emma whispered. Martha smiled gently. "Judith has friends who stayed in touch with you, kept her informed from a distance. She never stopped loving you, Emma." The nurse excused herself as Michael approached. Emma turned to him, her eyes glistening. "It seems I didn't know everything after all," she said quietly. Michael took his mother's arm, guiding her to a nearby bench. "I've been taken off their cases," he explained. "Hospital policy." Emma nodded distractedly, still processing Martha's revelations. "All these years, I thought they both hated me, that they'd erased me completely." They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in thought. Finally, Emma stood. "I should go home. Marcus will be worried, and I need to think about all this." Michael walked his mother to her car, promising to call with any updates on his grandparents' conditions. After watching her drive away, he gathered his belongings from his locker and headed home himself, the events of the day weighing heavily on his mind. The drive to his apartment took longer than usual, evening traffic clogging the streets. Michael used the time to replay the day's events, still hardly believing the cosmic coincidence that had brought his estranged grandparents into his operating room. Or perhaps it wasn't coincidence at all, but some form of cosmic alignment he didn't understand. His apartment welcomed him with silence and darkness. Michael dropped his keys onto the counter, too exhausted to even turn on the lights. He managed to shower and change before collapsing onto his bed, his body finally surrendering to the fatigue of nearly 40 straight hours of wakefulness. He had just drifted into the first layers of sleep when his phone rang, jolting him back to consciousness. Claire's name flashed on the screen. "Claire," he answered groggily. "What's wrong?" "Michael, Harold Thompson, is awake," she said without preamble, "and he's demanding to know who operated on him." Michael sat up, instantly alert. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet. He's quite forceful. The night nurse almost told him, but I intercepted." Claire paused. "And there's more. We've just discovered he's a member of the hospital's board of trustees." Michael felt a chill run through him. Harold Thompson wasn't just any patient. He was someone with significant influence over the hospital's operations, including staffing decisions. "Does he know who I am?" Michael asked, dreading the answer. "Not yet," Claire replied. "But he's insisting on speaking with the surgeon who operated on him. Dr. Patel is trying to redirect him, but he's persistent." Michael closed his eyes, the implications sinking in. His career, which he'd built through years of dedication and sacrifice, could potentially be destroyed by the very man whose life he'd saved, a man who had already proven capable of cutting family ties completely. "I'll be there first thing in the morning," Michael said finally. "Thanks for the heads up, Claire." After hanging up, Michael sat on the edge of his bed, sleep now impossible. He stared at the phone in his hand, debating whether to call his mother again. Instead, he pulled up an old photograph, one of the few he'd seen of his mother as a young woman, standing between her parents at her high school graduation. Their smiles looked genuine in the faded image, giving no hint of the family fracture that would come just a few years later when Emma fell in love with Marcus Johnson. Michael stared at Harold Thompson's younger face, trying to reconcile that image with the unconscious patient he'd operated on hours earlier, and the apparently formidable hospital board member now threatening his career. He placed the phone on his nightstand and lay back down, mind racing with possible scenarios for the morning's inevitable confrontation. Sleep remained elusive as he strategized and worried, the weight of family history and professional ethics competing for dominance in his thoughts. Michael pulled into the hospital parking lot at dawn, his car one of only a few in the visitor section at this early hour. He parked abruptly, feeling the gravity of the situation settle over him. Not only was his career potentially in jeopardy, but the truth that connected 3 generations of his family was about to explode in the next few hours. The hospital corridors seemed unnaturally quiet as Michael made his way toward the administration wing. Each step felt heavier than the last, his mind racing with possible outcomes of the meeting that awaited him. The hastily convened ethics committee had gathered in conference room B, a fact Michael learned from the terse email that had arrived in his inbox at 5:30 that morning. As he approached the room, he could hear voices inside, one particularly forceful and commanding even through the closed door. Taking a deep breath, Michael straightened his white coat and knocked once before entering. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Dr. Simmons sat at the head of the table, flanked by the hospital's legal counsel and the chief of surgery. 2 senior board members occupied the opposite end. But it was the 6th person who commanded the room, Harold Thompson, looking remarkably alert in a hospital bed that had been wheeled in specially for this meeting. "Dr. Johnson," Simmons began formally, "thank you for joining us on such short notice. As you're aware, we're convened to discuss a serious breach of hospital protocol regarding your involvement in Mr. Thompson's care." Michael nodded, taking the only empty seat, directly across from Harold. Up close, his grandfather looked both frailer and more formidable than he had anticipated. The medical equipment attached to him couldn't disguise the steel in his gaze. "This doctor violated the most basic protocols," Harold declared, his voice strong despite his physical condition. "He performed surgery on me while concealing our family connection. That's not just unprofessional, it's potentially criminal negligence." Michael leaned forward, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Thompson, when I identified you, you were already stabilized from the first surgery. I had no idea who you were when you arrived in my emergency room." "And the second procedure?" Harold countered immediately. "Are you claiming you still didn't know then? Or will you admit there was a clear conflict of interest?" The hospital attorney jotted notes, her expression revealing nothing. Dr. Simmons shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I knew by then," Michael acknowledged. "But you were experiencing secondary bleeding. The priority was saving your life, not navigating bureaucratic protocols." "Bureaucratic?" Harold's eyebrows shot up. "These are ethical standards designed to protect patients from doctors whose judgment might be compromised by personal connections." The committee members exchanged glances. Michael could sense they were inclined to side with Harold, whose influence in the hospital was clearly substantial. His career, built through years of dedication and sacrifice, seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. "Dr. Johnson," the chief of surgery spoke up, "while we appreciate the emergency nature of the situation, you had multiple opportunities to recuse yourself. The fact that you continued treating Mr. Thompson after discovering your relationship is concerning." Michael opened his mouth to respond when the door opened behind him. All heads turned to see a hospital wheelchair being pushed into the already crowded room. In it sat Judith Thompson, her head still wrapped in bandages, her face pale but determined. "Judith, what are you doing here?" Harold's voice changed instantly, softening with concern. "You should be resting." "Harold, stop this right now," Judith said, her voice weak but carrying a surprising authority. "This young man saved our lives." "Judith, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, a strength belying her fragile appearance. "This is our grandson, Harold. Our grandson that we were never allowed to know." Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. The committee members looked between Harold, Judith, and Michael, clearly stunned by this unexpected development. Dr. Simmons cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Thompson, are you confirming that Dr. Johnson is indeed your grandson?" Judith nodded firmly. "Emma's son, our only grandchild." At that moment, the door opened again, and Emma entered quietly. She had evidently been waiting outside, perhaps summoned by a sympathetic nurse. She moved directly to Judith's side, their eyes meeting in a charged moment of recognition after 25 years of separation. "Why now, Mom?" Emma asked softly. "After all this time?" The question hung in the air, loaded with decades of pain and abandonment. Before Judith could answer, a sudden commotion drew everyone's attention to Harold. His face had contorted in pain, his hand clutching at his chest as the monitors attached to him began to sound alarms. "He's in distress." Michael was on his feet instantly, professional instincts overriding everything else. He rushed to Harold's side, checking vital signs with practiced efficiency. "Blood pressure dropping rapidly," he called out, already pressing the emergency button on the wall. "Possible cardiac event. We need a crash cart in here now." The ethics committee scattered, making room as Michael tilted Harold's bed flat and began chest compressions. Despite the personal complications, his medical training took over completely. Within moments, a code team rushed into the room, bringing with them the emergency equipment Michael had called for. "Continue compressions," Michael directed the base team, stepping aside to allow the ICU nurses access. "His surgical site is also at risk. Watch for signs of bleeding." Dr. Simmons appeared at Michael's elbow. "Johnson, you need to step back. You're not supposed to be treating him." Michael reluctantly moved away, watching as the team worked to stabilize his grandfather. Harold was quickly wheeled out of the conference room toward the ICU, the code team continuing treatment as they moved. In the sudden quiet left behind, Emma stood frozen beside Judith's wheelchair, both women looking stunned by the rapid turn of events. "He'll be all right," Michael assured them, though the medical professional in him knew that Harold's condition was precarious at best. "Dr. Patel is excellent. He'll take good care of him." Judith reached for Emma's hand, gripping it tightly. Years of separation seemed to dissolve in that simple contact. "I never stopped thinking about you," she whispered. "Not for a single day." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Then why didn't you reach out? 25 years, Mom. 25 years of silence." Dr. Simmons cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion somewhere more private. The ethics committee will reconvene at a later date, given the circumstances." As the committee members filed out, Michael approached his mother and grandmother. "Let me take you somewhere quiet," he offered. "We can wait for news about Harold together." He guided them to a small private waiting room reserved for families of critical patients. Once inside, Emma sank into a chair, the emotional weight of the day clearly taking its toll. "I need to understand," she said after a long silence. "All these years I thought you both hated me for marrying Marcus, that you couldn't accept having a black son-in-law." Judith shook her head sadly. "It was never that simple, Emma." "Then what was it?" Emma demanded, decades of hurt rising to the surface. "What could possibly justify cutting off your own daughter?" Before Judith could answer, Michael's pager beeped urgently. "It's about Harold," he said, reading the message. Dr. Patel wants to do immediate surgery. I need to speak with him." In the corridor outside the operating rooms, Michael found Dr. Patel reviewing scan results. "How bad is it?" Michael asked without preamble. "Pre-existing cardiac condition exacerbated by the accident and subsequent stress," Patel explained, showing Michael the images. "The confrontation in that meeting room certainly didn't help. We're prepping for surgery now." Michael nodded, studying the scans. "His chances?" Patel's expression was grave. "Honestly, 50-50 at best. His age and the multiple traumas are significant factors. Plus, there's evidence of long-term cardiac issues that were never properly addressed." Michael returned to the waiting room with this sobering assessment. Emma and Judith looked up expectantly as he entered. "They're taking him to surgery now," Michael explained gently. "He has a pre-existing heart condition that was aggravated by the accident and recent events." "Will he survive?" Judith asked directly, her eyes clear and steady despite her own injuries. "Dr. Patel is excellent," Michael replied, diplomatically avoiding a direct answer. "They're doing everything possible." Judith seemed to understand what remained unsaid. She reached again for Emma's hand, clutching it between both of hers. "He might not make it," she whispered, "and then you two will never know why he did what he did." Emma's expression hardened slightly. "I know why. He rejected us because Marcus was black. What other explanation could there be for cutting off your only child?" Judith looked into her daughter's eyes, a lifetime of secrets and pain reflected in her gaze. "The truth is much more complicated than that," she replied softly, as the door opened and Dr. Simmons entered, his expression grave. "The truth is much more complicated than that," Judith replied softly as the door opened and Dr. Simmons entered, his expression grave. "We've managed to stabilize him, but the next 24 hours will be critical," Dr. Simmons announced, his voice carrying the weight of professional caution. "If he makes it through the night, it would be something of a miracle." Michael thanked Dr. Simmons, who nodded and stepped out, leaving the 3 generations of the Thompson-Johnson family alone in the small waiting room. An uncomfortable silence settled over them, broken only by the distant sounds of hospital equipment and muffled conversations from the hallway. Judith's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the blanket across her lap. Her own injuries, though less severe than Harold's, were still evident in her pale complexion and the careful way she held herself. Despite her physical fragility, her eyes remained clear and determined as she looked between her daughter and grandson. "We should go to his room," she said finally. "I want to be there when he wakes up." Michael helped wheel his grandmother to the ICU, with Emma following silently behind. The ICU room was dimly lit, filled with the steady beeping of monitors tracking Harold's precarious vital signs. The man, who had seemed so formidable in the ethics committee meeting, now looked diminished, tubes and wires connecting him to various machines that sustained his life. As the 3 of them settled into their vigil, Judith's gaze never left her husband's face. After several minutes of silence, she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Harold wasn't always the man you think he was, Emma. The man who rejected you wasn't the man I married." Judith paused, gathering her strength. "What I'm about to tell you has been our secret for over 50 years. Emma leaned forward, her expression guarded but attentive. Michael stood near the door, caught between his role as a doctor and his place in this unfolding family drama. When Harold was 23, before we were married, he was driving home late one rainy night, Judith began. He'd been at a friend's party and had a few drinks. Not drunk, but not entirely sober either. On a dark stretch of road, he hit something. Someone. Emma's breath caught audibly, her eyes widening as she began to understand the direction of this revelation. It was a child, a little black boy, only 8 years old, who was crossing the road to get home, Judith continued, her voice growing unsteady. Harold panicked. He was scared and confused, and he made a terrible choice. He drove away. He fled the scene of an accident, Emma whispered, horrified. Judith nodded slowly. The boy survived, thank God, but he was badly injured, left with a permanent disability. Harold read about it in the newspaper the next day, and the guilt, it changed him. He was never caught or identified as the driver, but he never forgave himself. Michael moved closer, processing this new information that cast his grandfather in a completely different light. So when Emma brought Marcus home all those years later, it was like Harold's greatest shame had come back to haunt him, Judith confirmed. Seeing a young black man in our home, about to become part of our family. Harold didn't see your father, Emma. He saw the embodiment of his greatest sin, a daily reminder of what he'd done. Emma covered her mouth with her hands, tears forming in her eyes. Why didn't you tell me this before? All these years, I thought. He made me promise never to tell anyone, Judith replied. He preferred that you hate him for being a racist than know the truth about what he'd done. In his mind, it was his punishment to lose you. Michael observed his grandfather's unconscious form with new understanding. The complexity of human nature, how a single event could shape a life, how shame could masquerade as hatred, struck him profoundly. It doesn't justify what he did to us, Michael said softly. Cutting Mom off, refusing to meet Dad, missing my entire childhood. Understanding the reason doesn't erase the pain he caused. No, it doesn't, Judith agreed, reaching for Emma's hand. Nothing can justify those lost years. I should have been stronger, should have stood up to him. That's my guilt to bear. Emma wiped away tears with the back of her hand. Did you ever find out what happened to the boy? The one Grandpa hit? Harold tracked him from a distance, Judith explained. Made anonymous donations to his family for medical bills. The boy grew up to become a teacher, I believe. Harold kept newspaper clippings about him, hidden where he thought I wouldn't find them. The three fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts as they watched Harold's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance. The portrait of the man Emma had carried in her mind for 25 years, a cold, unfeeling bigot, was dissolving, replaced by something more complex. A deeply flawed man, crippled by his own guilt and shame. Later that evening, as Emma stepped out to call Marcus, Michael found himself alone with his unconscious grandfather. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor provided a backdrop to his thoughts as he studied the elderly man's face, searching for resemblances to himself or his mother. A slight change in Harold's breathing pattern caught Michael's attention. As he moved closer to check the monitors, Harold's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as they settled on Michael's face. My grandson, Harold whispered, his voice raspy from the breathing tube that had been removed only hours ago. You saved me. To punish me. Michael was startled by the question, by the vulnerability in this man who had seemed so intimidating just that morning. No, he answered truthfully. I saved you because it's my job. And because maybe there's still time for us to build something. Harold's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve that chance. Maybe not, Michael acknowledged. But you have it. Anyway. Harold's gaze drifted toward the door. Your mother? She's here. She knows everything now. Judith told us about the accident. A single tear escaped, rolling down Harold's weathered cheek. Before he could respond, fatigue overcame him, and his eyes closed again. His breathing settled back into the rhythm of sleep, but his hand moved slightly, as if reaching out. After a moment's hesitation, Michael took it, feeling the paper-thin skin and prominent bones of a hand that had never held his before. Over the next several days, Harold's condition gradually stabilized. The crisis had passed, though his recovery would be long and uncertain. Michael found himself dividing his time between his hospital duties and visits to his grandparents' rooms, building tentative bridges with these strangers who were his blood. Meanwhile, Michael faced his own professional reckoning. The ethics committee reconvened, this time with Judith providing surprising testimony in Michael's favor. She spoke eloquently about his professionalism and care, emphasizing that his actions had saved Harold's life twice. "My grandson did what any good doctor would do," she told the committee firmly. "He put his patient's needs above all else. If that violates your protocols, perhaps your protocols need reconsideration." The committee deliberated for less than an hour before reaching their decision. Michael would retain his position, though with a formal written warning in his file about the importance of disclosing potential conflicts of interest. "You're lucky," Dr. Simmons told him afterward. "If Judith hadn't spoken up, things might have gone differently." A month after the accident, Harold and Judith had recovered enough to be discharged from the hospital. The question of where they would go led to a tense family discussion that ended with a surprising solution. They would stay temporarily with Emma and Marcus while Harold completed his recovery. The day of the move, Michael helped his grandparents pack their belongings from the hospital room that had been their home for weeks. As he carefully placed Harold's medications in a bag, he noticed his grandfather watching him with an unreadable expression. "I never thought I'd have a doctor in the family," Harold said quietly. Michael zipped the bag closed. "And I never thought I'd operate on my grandfather before I'd even met him." The faintest smile touched Harold's lips. Life has strange ways of bringing people together. That evening, in the dining room of Emma and Marcus's home, the unlikely family gathered for their first meal together. The conversation was stilted at first, decades of separation creating barriers that wouldn't quickly fall. But as the evening progressed, small moments of connection appeared. A shared smile over a childhood story, a past dish, a question asked and honestly answered. As dessert was served, Harold cleared his throat, commanding attention in a way that suggested his former authority. "I've lost 25 years because of fear and shame," he said, his voice steady despite his physical weakness. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm grateful for the chance to know the family I rejected." Emma studied her father for a long moment, the complex emotions of their history evident in her expression. Finally, she reached her hand across the table toward him. "A bridge takes time to build, Dad, but at least now we're all on the same side of the chasm." Michael smiled, watching the beginning of his family's reconstruction as he poured a glass of wine for Judith. The bonds being formed were fragile, tentative but real. "You know," he said with a wry smile, "most doctors meet their grandparents before operating on them, but I guess our family never did anything the conventional way." For the first time in decades, the sound of genuine laughter filled the room, building the first arch of the bridge across the chasm that had separated them. The sound of laughter was short-lived but genuine, a fragile bridge spanning decades of silence. 3 weeks after that first dinner, Michael found himself navigating the delicate terrain of his newly expanded family while maintaining his demanding schedule at the hospital. The strange duality of his life, respected physician in one realm, newfound grandson in another, created a surreal quality to his days. "Dr. Johnson, trauma incoming, ETA 3 minutes, a nurse called as Michael completed notes on his previous patient. "On my way," he responded automatically, his mind shifting gears from thoughts of family to the focused clarity of emergency medicine. Hours later, exhausted but satisfied after stabilizing a car accident victim, Michael drove across town to his grandparents' apartment. Though they had initially stayed with his parents upon discharge from the hospital, Harold had insisted on returning to their own place as soon as medically advisable. "I've imposed enough," he had stated with that familiar stubbornness that Michael was quickly coming to recognize as a family trait. The apartment building was elegant but understated, reflecting a comfortable lifestyle without ostentation. Michael knocked lightly before using the key Judith had insisted he take for emergencies. The living room was softly lit, classical music playing quietly from hidden speakers. "Michael, is that you?" Judith called from the study. "Come see what I've found." Following her voice, Michael discovered his grandmother seated before an antique desk, surrounded by photo albums and yellowing papers. Her face brightened as he entered, the warmth in her expression still a novelty to him, after years of imagining cold, rejecting grandparents. "I've been going through some old albums," she explained, patting the chair beside her. "Things I thought you might like to see." Michael settled next to her, oddly moved by the simple act of leafing through family photographs, images of his mother as a child, his grandparents, and their youth. Great-grandparents he'd never known existed. Each turn of the page revealed another piece of his identity that had been denied him. "Mom never had any of these," he remarked, touching a photo of Emma at perhaps 7 years old, gap-toothed and beaming on a bicycle. "Harold put everything away after—" Judith paused, her voice faltering. "After she left. But I kept these hidden. I couldn't bear to lose all of her." From the doorway came a soft clearing of throat. Harold stood watching them, his frame thinner since the accident, but his posture still carrying hints of his former authority. His expression was unreadable as he observed his wife and grandson poring over the forbidden memories. "Dinner will be ready soon," he said simply, before retreating to the kitchen. Michael exchanged a glance with his grandmother, both recognizing Harold's discomfort, without needing words. The man was trying in his own way, but emotional territory remained treacherous. The following afternoon, Emma arrived at Judith's invitation for tea. Michael, stopping by after his shift, found them seated in the sunroom, their conversation punctuated by occasional tears and more frequent cautious laughter. They looked up as he entered, and he was struck by their resemblance, something in the angle of their chins, the set of their eyes, genetic echoes he'd never noticed before. "Michael, perfect timing," Judith exclaimed. "Your mother was just telling me about your first science fair project." "The exploding volcano that actually caught fire?" Michael groaned, settling into a chair. "Not my finest moment." Emma smiled, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Your father still complains about the scorch marks on the garage ceiling." The three of them chatted easily, the conversation flowing more naturally with each passing visit. But Michael couldn't help noticing his grandfather's absence, how Harold observed them from doorways or adjacent rooms without fully participating. Later that week, Michael volunteered to drive Harold to his follow-up appointment. The ride began in awkward silence, the older man staring fixedly out the passenger window at the passing cityscape. "How are you feeling physically?" Michael finally asked, his doctor's instincts providing safe conversational ground. "Better than expected," Harold replied after a moment. "Your colleague, Dr. Patel, says I'm healing well for a man my age." More silence followed, broken only by the soft hum of the car's engine and the occasional direction from the GPS. As they waited at a red light, Harold suddenly spoke, his voice so low Michael almost missed it. "I would like to know you, if there's still time." The weight of those words hung between them as the light changed to green. Michael navigated through the intersection before responding, choosing his words carefully. "I'd like that too," he said simply. Harold nodded once, returning his gaze to the window, but something in the set of his shoulders had eased slightly. At the hospital, Dr. Patel's examination was thorough and mostly positive, though he expressed concern about Harold's recovery environment. "The stairs in your apartment building are problematic during this phase of cardiac rehabilitation," he explained. "Ideally, you should be in a single-level living situation with someone available to assist you as needed." In the corridor afterward, Michael considered the options. "You could stay with me, but my apartment is small, and I'm hardly ever there with my schedule." Harold shook his head. "We've imposed enough on everyone." "What about Mom and Dad's place?" Michael suggested hesitantly. "They have that guest suite on the main floor, and someone would always be around." The flash of apprehension that crossed Harold's face spoke volumes. The prospect of living under Marcus Johnson's roof clearly unsettled him. I know it's not ideal, Michael acknowledged, but medically speaking, it makes the most sense right now. That evening, Michael broached the subject with his parents. Emma seemed cautiously receptive, but Marcus's expression remained guarded. It would only be temporary, Michael explained, just until Grandpa's cardiac rehab is further along. It's your house too, Dad, Emma said softly. I won't agree to anything you're uncomfortable with. Marcus paced the kitchen, his academic's mind visibly working through the complex ethical and emotional dimensions of the situation. 25 years is a long time to hold a grudge, he finally said, but it's an equally long time to endure rejection. The uncomfortable standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the unexpected arrival of Harold himself. Standing at their door the following afternoon, leaning heavily on a cane, he appeared older and more vulnerable than Michael had ever seen him. I've come to speak with Marcus, he announced to Emma, who stood shocked in the doorway. Alone, if possible. Emma reluctantly showed her father to the back patio where Marcus was grading papers, then retreated to the kitchen, visibly anxious. Michael joined her there, both of them pretending not to watch the two men through the window. From their vantage point, they could see but not hear the interaction. Harold speaking at length, Marcus listening impassively, then responding with what appeared to be pointed questions. The conversation continued far longer than either Emma or Michael expected, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the patio before the men finally stood. When they entered the kitchen, the tension in Marcus's shoulders had eased somewhat, though his expression remained serious. Harold looked exhausted, but oddly unburdened. Your father and I have reached an understanding, Harold told Emma. He has graciously offered to let us stay until my health improves. If that's truly what you want, Emma responded carefully. What I want, Harold said slowly, is a chance to know my family before it's too late. Even if I haven't earned that right. The decision made, Michael helped his grandparents prepare for the temporary move. In Harold's study, he carefully packed medications and personal items while his grandfather sorted through papers at his desk. Leave that bottom drawer, Harold instructed. Those are personal documents I'll handle myself. Later, when Harold stepped out to speak with Judith, curiosity overcame Michael's better judgment. He slid open the drawer, finding a worn manila folder filled with yellowing newspaper clippings. The headlines immediately clarified their significance. Child struck in hit and run. 8-year-old boy recovering after mysterious accident. Search for driver continues. Michael carefully replaced the folder, a new understanding of his grandfather settling over him. The secret that destroyed his family had been preserved with dolorosa precision, a self-inflicted wound Harold had kept open for decades. 2 days later, the Thompson grandparents were installed in the guest suite of Emma and Marcus's home. The arrangement was awkward at first. Harold particularly seemed to move through the house like a visitor afraid of touching anything. Judith adapted more easily, quickly establishing a rapport with Marcus over their shared interest in historical literature. As Michael helped unpack the last of their essential belongings, he caught his mother watching her father from the doorway, her expression a complex mixture of lingering hurt and cautious hope. This is strange for everyone, Michael acknowledged quietly, joining her. Emma nodded. 25 years ago, I never would have imagined him under our roof. Marcus never expected to sit across a dinner table from the man who rejected him solely for the color of his skin. It wasn't solely for that, Michael reminded her gently. Not that it makes it right, but... I know, Emma sighed. The accident, the guilt, it helps explain it but doesn't erase what happened. She squared her shoulders. You and your father can help them settle in. I've made up my mind. They can stay with us until Harold is fully recovered. While helping his grandparents make their beds with fresh linens, Michael found, hidden in the bottom of Harold's suitcase, a yellowing folder with newspaper clippings about the accident that had occurred decades ago. The secret that destroyed his family had been preserved with painful precision. The manila folder lay heavy in Michael's hands, its edges worn from years of handling. Inside, the yellowing newspaper clippings chronicled a moment that had altered the course of his family forever. The headlines stared back at him accusingly. Child struck in hit and run. 8-year-old David Wilson. Still critical after roadside accident. Police search for driver continues. Michael carefully closed the folder, his medical mind cataloging the likely injuries such an accident would cause to a small child. Broken bones, internal bleeding, potential brain trauma. He replaced the folder in Harold's suitcase, arranging the clothes around it exactly as he'd found them. "What are you doing?" Harold's voice from the doorway made Michael start. "Just putting away some of your things," Michael answered, guilt coloring his tone despite his attempt at casualness. Harold's gaze flickered to the suitcase, then back to his grandson's face. His expression hardened as understanding dawned. "You found the articles." "I wasn't trying to pry," Michael began, then stopped himself. "Actually, that's not true. I was curious." Harold moved into the room with measured steps, his reliance on the cane less pronounced than it had been in the hospital, but still evident. He lowered himself carefully onto the edge of the bed. "Why did you keep them all these years?" Michael asked, sitting beside him. Harold was silent for so long that Michael wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of self-recrimination. "Punishment," he said simply. "A reminder of what I am capable of at my worst moment." "But why keep it secret? Why let it destroy your relationship with Mom instead of just explaining?" Harold's laugh was hollow. "Explain? How does one explain abandoning an injured child on a dark road? How could I tell my daughter I was the kind of man who drives away while a boy bleeds on the pavement?" Michael absorbed this, trying to reconcile the broken man beside him with the cruel figure who had populated family stories. "The accident was terrible," he acknowledged. "But your response afterward, cutting off Mom, refusing to even meet Dad, that was a choice you made every day for 25 years. Harold's shoulders slumped further. "When Emma brought Marcus home, all I could see was that boy on the road. Black skin, broken by my cowardice. I couldn't face him without confessing, and I couldn't confess without destroying everything. So I destroyed just one thing instead, my relationship with my daughter." That evening, during a strained dinner where conversation remained carefully confined to neutral topics, Michael observed the delicate dance of his newly expanded family. Judith filled silences with gentle questions about Emma's work as a high school principal. Marcus discussed recent developments in his field of anthropology. Harold largely observed, offering only brief responses when directly addressed. Later, as Michael helped clear the dishes, Emma pulled him aside in the kitchen. "Dad seems more withdrawn tonight," she observed. "Did something happen?" Michael hesitated, unsure how much to share. "We talked about the accident. I found some newspaper clippings he's kept all these years." Emma's expression darkened. "He's been torturing himself with those for decades. Mom told me he used to take them out late at night when he thought she was asleep." The following day, Michael's shift at the hospital provided a welcome return to the familiar terrain of medical emergencies. Problems with clear protocols and solutions, unlike the murky waters of family reconciliation. During his lunch break, he found himself researching David Wilson, the boy from the accident, driven by a curiosity he couldn't explain even to himself. The information was surprisingly easy to find. David Wilson had become an educator, currently serving as a professor of social work at the City University. His faculty biography mentioned his work with at-risk youth and his personal experience overcoming childhood trauma. A photo showed a distinguished black man in his early 50s, seated in a wheelchair, smiling confidently at the camera. Michael stared at the image, wondering what this man knew or suspected about the driver who had altered his life. Had he spent decades wondering who had hit him that night? Did he harbor the same festering wound that Harold carried? That weekend, Michael's birthday arrived with little fanfare. He had requested a small gathering, conscious of his grandparents' still fragile integration into the family. Emma had insisted on baking his favorite chocolate cake, the same recipe she'd used since his 10th birthday. "I can't believe you're 32, she said, arranging candles with precision. "It seems impossible." "Says the woman who still cuts my sandwiches diagonally," Michael teased, earning a playful swat. The celebration was modest, but warmer than Michael had anticipated. Marcus grilled steaks on the patio, engaging Harold in surprisingly companionable conversation about fishing. Judith presented Michael with an antique pocket watch that had belonged to his great-grandfather. "It should have been yours years ago," she said softly, as he examined the intricate engraving. As the evening progressed, Michael noticed Harold watching him with an unreadable expression. When they found themselves briefly alone in the kitchen, Harold approached him hesitantly. "The watch seems to be running slow," he observed, nodding toward Michael's wrist where the heirloom now rested. "I could help you adjust it. I used to be quite good with timepieces." This unexpected offer led to an impromptu lesson at the kitchen table, Harold's arthritic fingers demonstrating surprising dexterity as he opened the watch's delicate mechanism. Michael observed closely, struck by the simple intimacy of the moment. A grandfather teaching his grandson a skill as if they'd done this 100 times before. "There," Harold said finally. "That should keep better time now." When guests began arriving, mostly colleagues from the hospital and a few close friends, Michael was gratified to see his grandparents making efforts to engage. Judith charmed everyone with her warmth, while Harold maintained a quiet dignity that didn't entirely mask his discomfort in the unfamiliar social setting. Claire, Michael's nurse colleague, pulled him aside after meeting the elder Thompsons. "So these are the famous grandparents who nearly got you fired?" she whispered. "They seem surprisingly normal." "Family is never what you expect," Michael replied, watching as Judith showed photos on her phone to his friends. As the evening wound down and the cake was served, Michael found himself unexpectedly emotional as he looked around at the gathered faces. The family he'd always known now expanded to include those who had been missing for so long. The resentment he'd carried on his mother's behalf had not disappeared, but it had begun to transform into something more complex, tempered by understanding. When it came time for toasts, Michael raised his glass and made an impulsive decision. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began. "Especially my grandparents, who've brought our family full circle in many ways." He paused, glancing at Harold. "Actually, there's something I've been thinking about. Grandpa, I've done some research on David Wilson, the boy from the accident. He's a professor now, working with at-risk youth. Maybe it's time to find him, to make that amends." The silence that followed was absolute. Harold's face drained of color, the glass in his hand trembling visibly. "You have no idea what you're asking," he said, his voice barely audible before rising sharply. "No idea at all." Harold set his glass down with enough force that wine sloshed over the rim, then turned and walked stiffly from the room. The remaining guests exchanged uncomfortable glances as Judith hurried after her husband. Emma approached Michael, her expression troubled. "What were you thinking, bringing that up in front of everyone?" "I thought it might help him," Michael defended, though already regretting his timing. "Carrying this secret has poisoned his life for decades. Maybe facing it directly is the only way forward." The party dispersed shortly afterward, guests making polite excuses as they sensed the family tension. Michael helped his parents clean up, the festive mood thoroughly dispelled. Later that night, unable to sleep, Michael sat at his laptop in the guest bedroom that had been his childhood room. The search for David Wilson's social work professor yielded several results, including a university email address and office phone number. On impulse, Michael opened his email program and began typing. After composing and deleting 3 different versions, he finally settled on simplicity. Dr. Wilson, my name is Michael Johnson. I believe you were involved in an accident many years ago with my grandfather, Harold Thompson. I would like to speak with you about this if you're willing. Sincerely, Dr. Michael Johnson. His finger hovered over the send button for several long moments as he considered the potential consequences. This message could reopen wounds, create legal problems, or destroy the fragile new connections forming in his family. It could also, possibly, offer a path to healing that had eluded them all for decades. With the address of David Wilson noted on a piece of paper, Michael hesitated before sending a simple message. My name is Michael Johnson. I would like to talk to you about something that happened a long time ago with my grandfather, Harold Thompson. Michael's finger hovered over the send button for what felt like hours. Was he stepping too far, too fast? Finally, with a deep breath, he clicked send, watching the email disappear into the digital ether. Whatever happened next, he'd set something irreversible in motion. Sleep eluded him that night. He tossed and turned, his mind conjuring scenarios of how David Wilson might respond. Angry denunciation, legal threats, or perhaps just silence, which in some ways would be worse. When his alarm finally pulled him from fitful slumber, Michael reached for his phone immediately, checking for notifications. There it was. A new email from D. Wilson, a City University EDU, received at 5:47 a.m. With trembling fingers, Michael opened it. Dr. Johnson, I've often wondered if someone from the Thompson family would ever reach out. Yes, I'm willing to meet. Tomorrow at noon, campus coffee shop. David Wilson. The response was so direct, so devoid of the anger or confusion Michael had anticipated, that he read it 3 times to ensure he hadn't misinterpreted. David's apparent foreknowledge was surprising. Had he always suspected Harold was the driver? Throughout his morning rounds at the hospital, Michael found his concentration wavering. The Thompson-Wilson collision that had occurred decades before his birth had altered the trajectory of his own life in ways he was only beginning to understand. You seem distracted today, observed Dr. Patel as they reviewed patient charts. Everything all right? Family matters, Michael replied vaguely. Nothing that will affect my work. That evening, Michael invented a vague excuse about meeting a colleague for lunch the following day. He avoided direct eye contact with Harold when explaining his absence from their planned family lunch, guilt weighing heavily as he fabricated details about a non-existent medical consultation. The next morning, Michael drove to City University with a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. The campus sprawled across several downtown blocks, a mix of modern glass structures and dignified brick buildings from an earlier era. Following signs to the humanities complex, he finally located the coffee shop, a bright, airy space filled with students bent over laptops and textbooks. Michael scanned the room, his gaze stopping on a man seated alone by the window. Professor David Wilson appeared younger than his 53 years, with closely cropped salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly air. The wheelchair positioned at his table was sleek and modern, clearly a permanent fixture in his life. Drawing a deep breath, Michael approached. Professor Wilson? The man looked up, his expression open and curious. Dr. Johnson, I presume? His handshake was firm, his smile genuine. Please sit down. I took the liberty of ordering you a coffee. Hope black is acceptable. Perfect, thank you, Michael replied, settling into the chair opposite. He struggled to reconcile this composed, seemingly benevolent man with the traumatized child from the yellowing newspaper clippings. I imagine you have questions about how I knew who you were, David began, addressing the unspoken query hanging between them. Over the years, I pieced together bits of information. The make of the car from paint traces, the approximate time and location. Witnesses who saw a car matching that description parked regularly at Thompson Industries. He sipped his coffee. I never had enough for legal proof, but I've known for at least 20 years that Harold Thompson was most likely the driver who hit me that night. Michael exhaled slowly. Why didn't you ever confront him? Seek justice. David's smile turned pensive. What would justice have looked like? Prison for an old man? Financial compensation I didn't need? He gestured around the bustling coffee shop. I built a good life. The accident shaped me, certainly, physically and otherwise, but it didn't define me. As their conversation continued, Michael was increasingly struck by David's apparent lack of bitterness. The professor spoke of his work with troubled youth, his academic research on trauma recovery, and his family, a wife of 25 years and twin daughters now in graduate school. The accident taught me something profound about trauma, David explained. It's not just what happens to us, but how we carry it afterward that determines its power. Your grandfather ran away twice that night, first from the scene, then from the reality of what he'd done. I suspect he's been running ever since. Michael nodded slowly. He rejected my mother when she brought home my father, a black man. For years we assumed simple racism. Now we understand he was seeing you and my father, a reminder of his worst moment. A painful irony, David observed quietly. In trying to escape his guilt, he only multiplied its effects, fracturing his own family. When Michael described Harold's recent health crisis and the family's tentative steps toward reconciliation, David listened attentively, offering neither judgment nor absolution. What do you want from this meeting, Michael? He finally asked. Why reach out now after all this time? The question caught Michael off guard. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Part of me thought you deserved to know the truth was finally acknowledged. Part of me hoped it might help my grandfather find some peace before... He trailed off, unwilling to articulate the prognosis that every medical professional recognized in Harold's condition. Before he dies, David finished gently. I understand. As their meeting concluded, Michael felt simultaneously lighter and more troubled. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I wasn't sure what to expect. David handed him a business card. Feel free to contact me again if you think it would help your grandfather or your family. While this peaceful resolution should have provided closure, Michael found himself unsettled by David's composure, by the absence of the rage that Michael himself might have felt in his position. As he stood to leave, a final question escaped him. How can you be so forgiving? Who said anything about forgiveness? David replied, his expression serious but not unkind. I've made peace with what happened to me. That's not the same as absolving the man responsible. That's his journey, not mine. Meanwhile, across town, Harold's condition had deteriorated unexpectedly. Emma called Michael's cell phone repeatedly, finally leaving an urgent voicemail. Michael, come home as soon as you can. We've had to call an ambulance for your grandfather. Michael raced to the hospital, guilt compounding his concern. While he had been pursuing answers from David Wilson, Harold had been experiencing chest pains severe enough to warrant emergency transport. By the time Michael arrived at the emergency department, Harold had been stabilized but remained in a monitored bed, oxygen tubing circling his face. What happened? Michael demanded, quickly reviewing the chart at the foot of the bed. Judith, seated beside her husband, looked exhausted. He was having trouble breathing after breakfast. Then he became pale and said his chest felt tight. Harold's eyes flickered open at the sound of Michael's voice. You're here, he murmured weakly. Of course I'm here, Michael replied, professional assessment momentarily overshadowing personal complications. The ECG patterns showed concerning changes, suggesting the cardiac event had been more significant than Harold's previous episodes. Judith touched Michael's arm. He was upset this morning. After you left, he told me he knew where you were really going. Michael felt his stomach drop. How? He saw your computer screen last night, Judith explained quietly. The email to David Wilson. He didn't say anything, but he's been agitated ever since. In that moment, Michael understood that his well-intentioned intervention had potentially worsened his grandfather's health. The fear that had driven Harold for decades, fear of confronting his past, of being exposed, had been triggered by Michael's actions. "I'm sorry," he told Harold, genuine remorse in his voice. "I thought I was helping." Harold's response was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patel, who examined Harold thoroughly before turning to Michael with a concerned expression. "We should discuss his condition outside." In the hallway, Patel was direct. "This cardiac event was significant. His heart is weaker than we'd hoped following surgery. The emotional stress isn't helping." "Is he stable enough to return home?" Michael asked. "For now, yes, but with increased medication and monitoring. However, another episode like this one..." Patel left the implication hanging. When Michael returned to the room, he found Harold whispering something to Judith, who wiped tears from her eyes as she nodded. "What is it?" Michael asked, alarmed. "Your grandfather," Judith began, her voice breaking slightly, "has just told me he's afraid of dying this way, carrying his secret to the grave." That evening, after Harold had been discharged and settled back at Emma and Marcus's home, Michael faced the family's questions about his whereabouts during the emergency. "I need to tell you all something," he admitted, gathering them in the living room. "I met with David Wilson today." The reaction was immediate and heated. Emma gasped, Marcus straightened in his chair, and Judith reached instinctively for Harold's hand. "You had no right," Emma said, her voice tight with anger. "No right at all." "Someone needed to do something," Michael countered. "We've all been tiptoeing around this secret for months now, pretending acknowledgement is enough. But Grandpa is literally dying from the weight of it." "That was not your decision to make," Marcus interjected, uncharacteristically stern, however well-intentioned. Harold remained silent throughout the exchange, his expression unreadable. Only when the doorbell rang, interrupting the family confrontation, did he show any reaction, a slight tensing of his shoulders, as if bracing for impact. Marcus moved to answer the door, returning with a stunned expression. "Michael," he said quietly, "there's someone here to see us. It's David Wilson." Emma, paralyzed at the sight of David Wilson in her doorway, recognized immediately the man from the newspaper headline she'd found among Harold's belongings. The ghost that had haunted her family for decades now stood before her, not as a victim, but as an unexpected possibility of liberation. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the man in the wheelchair, the living embodiment of the newspaper clipping she had discovered among her father's possessions. David Wilson's presence in her home created a vacuum of sound, as if the very air had been sucked from the room. "Please," Emma finally managed, her voice barely audible. "Come in, Mr. Wilson." David wheeled himself forward with practiced ease, his expression calm but watchful, as he took in the shocked faces of the Thompson-Johnson family. Michael moved quickly to his side, guilt and surprise mingling on his features. "I didn't invite him," Michael explained hurriedly, looking between his mother and grandfather. "I had no idea he was coming." David's voice was measured, resonant with the authority of his academic position. "I made this decision myself, after our conversation earlier today. Some things are best addressed directly, and I felt this was one of them." The living room had never seemed smaller, the familiar space transformed by the presence of the man whose fate had shaped their family history. Harold remained seated, his face ashen, hands gripping the armrests of his chair, as if they might anchor him against a rising tide. "Michael told me about your recent health concerns," David continued, addressing Harold directly for the first time. "I thought perhaps it was time to close this chapter for all of us." Judith emerged from the kitchen, stopping abruptly when she saw their visitor. Recognition flashed across her face. Not of the man he was now, but of the child he had been half a century ago. "You're the boy," she whispered, one hand rising to cover her mouth. David nodded, acknowledging her recognition with dignity. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson. That was me a long time ago." The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly, the weight of 5 decades pressing down on them all. Marcus was the first to recover, his academic training perhaps giving him a framework for handling unprecedented situations. "Can I offer you some coffee, Professor Wilson?" he asked, providing a momentary escape from the emotional intensity. "That would be very kind, thank you," David replied, his eyes never leaving Harold's face. As Marcus retreated to the kitchen, Emma sank into a chair opposite David, her expression a complex mixture of fear and curiosity. "How did you find us?" she asked. "Your son provided enough information during our meeting today. The rest was simple research," David explained. "I've known who was responsible for my accident for many years, Mrs. Johnson. Finding your address wasn't difficult." Michael paced near the window, clearly uncomfortable with the situation he had inadvertently created. "I should have consulted everyone before contacting you," he admitted. "This affects all of us." "Yes, it does," David agreed, "which is precisely why I'm here. Some burdens aren't meant to be carried alone, or indefinitely." Harold finally spoke, his voice raspy and strained. "I don't want to see him. Not like this." He made a weak attempt to rise, but Judith placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Harold," she said quietly, "you've carried this for 50 years. Please." Marcus returned with a tray of coffee cups, the domestic normality of the act jarringly incongruous with the emotional tempest in the room. As cups were distributed, David spoke again, addressing the obvious tension. "I didn't come here seeking vengeance, Mr. Thompson. That might surprise you, but it's the truth." Harold's response was barely audible. "Why then?" "I came because I recognize something in your grandson today. The weight of a legacy he never chose, but is trying to heal, and because I believe in facing difficult truths directly." The conversation that followed was halting at first, words carefully chosen and silences heavy with unspoken thoughts. David explained how the accident had changed his life trajectory: physical therapy, adjustments to his mobility, the decision to channel his experience into helping others. "I won't pretend it was easy," he said, "but adversity shapes us in ways prosperity never could. My work with vulnerable youth grew directly from my experience of trauma and recovery." Throughout David's narrative, Harold remained silent, his eyes fixed on his hands. Only when David mentioned his mother's struggle to care for him as a single parent did Harold visibly react, a small shudder passing through his frame. "She had to work 2 jobs, David continued, to pay for the medical bills insurance wouldn't cover. She died when I was in graduate school, never knowing who was responsible for what happened to me." "I'm sorry," Harold whispered, the words seeming inadequate even as he spoke them. "I believe you are," David replied simply. The following morning, Michael stopped by his parents' house before his hospital shift to check on Harold. He found his grandfather alone in the sunroom, staring out at the garden where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. "How are you feeling today?" Michael asked cautiously, his medical training allowing him to assess Harold's physical state while avoiding the emotional minefield of yesterday's encounter. "Like a man who has lived too long," Harold replied, not turning from the window. "Your grandmother wants me to see him again, to speak with him properly." Michael sat in the adjacent chair, deliberately avoiding offering immediate advice. "And what do you want?" "What I want has never been particularly relevant," Harold said with unexpected bitterness. "What I deserve even less so." Later that day, Michael received a page during his rounds. Claire intercepted him in the corridor, her expression worried. "It's your grandfather again," she said without preamble. "Not as serious as last time, but they're bringing him in for observation." After ensuring his patients were covered, Michael hurried to the emergency department, where he found Emma already waiting. "Second episode in 2 days," she said, her voice strained. The paramedic said his vitals were better than yesterday, but the unspoken conclusion hung between them. Harold's heart was failing, his body wearing down under the combined weight of age, injury, and unresolved emotion. Dr. Patel emerged from the examination room, his expression grave but not alarmist. "We'd like to keep him overnight for monitoring," he explained. "The arrhythmia is concerning, but currently controlled with medication." When they were allowed to see Harold, Michael was struck by how much smaller his grandfather seemed in the hospital bed, diminished by the institutional setting and his own physical decline. Judith sat beside him, holding his hand with gentle determination. "The doctor says you need to rest," she told her husband, her tone brooking no argument. "No more excitement for today." Harold's eyes found Michael's across the room. "Did you know he was coming yesterday?" he asked directly. "No," Michael answered truthfully. "I was as surprised as everyone else." Harold seemed to accept this, closing his eyes briefly before speaking again. "I need to see him. One more time. Properly." Judith and Emma exchanged worried glances. "Harold, is that wise?" Judith asked. "Your heart—" "My heart has been broken for 50 years. Harold interrupted with unexpected clarity. "One more conversation won't make much difference." Against medical advice, but with grudging acquiescence from Dr. Patel, arrangements were made for David Wilson to visit Harold in the hospital the following day. The meeting would be brief, supervised by medical staff, with Harold's vital signs carefully monitored throughout. The morning of the visit found the family in various states of anxious anticipation. Emma paced the corridor outside Harold's room, while Marcus provided steady, silent support. Michael, technically off-duty but unwilling to be absent, reviewed his grandfather's charts repeatedly, searching for any sign of deterioration. When David arrived, punctual to the minute of the agreed time, he came alone, having declined Judith's offer to meet him at the hospital entrance. He navigated the familiar hospital corridors with ease, his wheelchair hardly slowing his progress. At the door to Harold's room, he paused, meeting Michael's eyes briefly. "Is he ready for this?" he asked quietly. "I'm not sure any of us are," Michael replied honestly. "But he insisted." David nodded once, then wheeled himself into the room. Harold was sitting up in bed, oxygen tubing in place, but otherwise looking more composed than he had the previous day. The two men regarded each other in silence, decades of unspoken history filling the space between them. "Mr. Thompson," David began formally. "Professor Wilson," Harold replied, equally formal. Another silence, this one less charged, but equally profound. Then Harold spoke, his voice steady despite his physical weakness. "I abandoned you on that road, left you bleeding alone in the dark. Then I spent 50 years running from what I'd done, destroying my relationship with my daughter in the process." He paused, gathering strength. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even have the right to ask for it." David moved his wheelchair closer to the bed, his expression thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn, Mr. Thompson. It's not a transaction. It's a choice, my choice. Whether you deserve it or not isn't the point." "Then what is the point?" Harold asked, genuine confusion evident in his voice. "The point is that holding on to this hasn't served either of us well," David replied. "You've been imprisoned by guilt. I've wondered about closure. Perhaps we can both find freedom in finally acknowledging the truth, openly." As their conversation continued, something remarkable happened. Harold's monitors, which had been showing elevated readings when David first entered, gradually stabilized. His breathing eased, His color improved, and the tension that had seemed a permanent feature of his body visibly diminished. Outside in the corridor, Michael watched the medical readouts with professional interest and personal amazement. "His vitals are actually improving," he murmured to Emma, who stood beside him with tears streaming unchecked down her face. "Is that possible?" she whispered. "Physically, I mean. The connection between emotional state and physical health is stronger than we sometimes acknowledge," Michael replied, watching through the glass as Harold reached a trembling hand toward David, who accepted it without hesitation. In that moment of connection, something seemed to pass between the two men. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but perhaps its precursor. Recognition, acknowledgement, the beginning of a path neither had thought possible. When the meeting concluded 30 minutes later, Harold appeared exhausted, but strangely peaceful. The monitors attached to him continued to show improved vital signs, a medical anomaly that Dr. Patel noted with professional curiosity when he examined Harold later that afternoon. As everyone left the room to give Harold and David privacy, the attending physician pulled Michael aside with a puzzled expression. "I don't know what happened in there today, but your grandfather's tests show an improvement that medical science cannot explain." "I don't know what happened in there today, but your grandfather's tests show an improvement that medical science cannot explain," Dr. Patel said, studying the charts with bewilderment. Michael nodded, equally surprised by the measurable improvement in Harold's condition. The medical professional in him searched for rational explanations, while the grandson simply felt grateful. "Sometimes the body knows what it needs better than we do," he replied. In the days that followed, Harold's recovery continued at a pace that surprised his entire medical team. What had seemed like an inevitable decline had somehow reversed course. By the end of the week, Dr. Patel was discussing discharge plans rather than palliative care options. "His heart function has improved by nearly 15%, Dr. Patel explained during rounds, allowing his residents to examine the before and after echocardiograms. "While still compromised, it's significantly better than we projected." Michael stood slightly apart from his colleagues, the dual role of physician and family member creating an invisible boundary. He had witnessed firsthand the transformation that had begun in that hospital room, not just physical, but something deeper, as if Harold had finally set down a burden he'd carried for half a century. On the day of discharge, Michael arrived early to help with the paperwork. He found his grandfather already dressed, sitting in a chair by the window rather than in the bed where he'd spent most of the previous week. "You're looking well," Michael observed, genuinely impressed by the improvement in Harold's color and posture. Harold's smile was slight but real. "Better than I deserve to be." "That's becoming a theme with you," Michael noted, settling into the adjacent chair. "Deserving or not deserving?" Harold considered this, his weathered hands resting lightly on his knees. "When you've done something terrible, you measure everything afterward against it. What you deserve becomes complicated." The drive home was quiet, Harold watching the city pass outside the car window with the contemplative gaze of someone seeing familiar landscapes with new eyes. When they arrived at Emma and Marcus's house, Harold paused before getting out of the car. "I'd like to visit David Wilson's center," he said suddenly, "the place where he works with those young people." Michael looked at him in surprise. "Are you sure that's a good idea? Your recovery is still fragile." "My recovery depends on more than just medicine," Harold replied with unexpected clarity. "I need purpose, Michael. Something to do with whatever time I have left." 2 weeks later, after Harold had regained enough strength to venture out more regularly, Michael drove his grandfather to the community center where David Wilson directed outreach programs for at-risk youth. The building was modest, but well-maintained, its brick facade brightened by a colorful mural depicting diverse young people engaged in various pursuits. David met them at the entrance, his expression neutral, but not unwelcoming. "Mr. Thompson, Dr. Johnson," he greeted them formally. "Thank you for coming." Inside, the center hummed with activity. Teenagers gathered around computers in one room, while younger children participated in a reading circle in another. A commercial kitchen at the back housed a culinary training program for young adults seeking employment skills. "We serve about 200 young people weekly," David explained as he guided them through the facility. "Many come from situations where they've faced significant trauma or disruption." Harold absorbed everything silently, his eyes tracking the interactions between staff and youth. In the recreation room, a heated basketball game was underway, the players' enthusiastic shouts echoing off the walls. "What do you need most?" Harold asked suddenly, the first words he'd spoken since they'd arrived. David considered the question seriously. "Consistent mentorship. These kids have had too many adults disappear from their lives. They need people who show up reliably, who see them as individuals with potential rather than problems to solve." Harold nodded slowly, his gaze still on the basketball game. "I understand." On the drive home, Harold was uncharacteristically animated, asking Michael questions about volunteer requirements and discussing ideas for program support. There was a light in his eyes that Michael had never seen before, purpose replacing penance. The following week established a new routine. 3 mornings a week, Michael would drop Harold at the community center on his way to the hospital. Initially, Harold simply observed, sitting quietly in the corner of various activity rooms. By the 3rd week, however, he had begun to engage, first with the staff, and then carefully with some of the young participants. "He has a way with the more withdrawn kids," David told Michael one afternoon, "perhaps because he recognizes something in them." Emma visited the center one day unannounced, watching from the doorway as her father patiently taught chess to a solemn 12-year-old boy. The sight of Harold, who had once been so rigid, so unforgiving, displaying such gentle patience, left her momentarily speechless. "He's different here," David observed, wheeling up beside her, less burdened. "I barely recognize him," Emma admitted. "The father I knew would never have volunteered his time like this." "Perhaps this is who he might have been without the accident," David suggested, "or who he's finally allowing himself to become." Meanwhile, Michael faced his own professional reckoning. The final meeting of the hospital ethics committee had been rescheduled several times due to Harold's medical events, but could no longer be postponed. The formal review of Michael's conduct, performing surgery on family members and the subsequent complications, would determine whether any permanent sanctions would affect his career. On the morning of the hearing, Michael dressed with particular care, the weight of professional judgment adding to his already considerable stress. As he checked his appearance one final time, his phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Grandpa insists on attending, says it's non-negotiable." Michael arrived at the hospital administration building to find not only Harold waiting, but also David Wilson. The unlikely pair sat in the lobby, engaged in what appeared to be serious conversation. "What are you both doing here?" Michael asked, genuinely bewildered. "Supporting you," Harold replied simply. "This situation is entirely my creation. I won't let you face the consequences alone." The ethics committee, reconvened in the same conference room where Harold had collapsed weeks earlier, seemed surprised by the addition of David to the proceedings. Dr. Simmons, chairing the committee, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Wilson, while we appreciate your interest, this is an internal hospital matter regarding Dr. Johnson's professional conduct. I'm here at Harold Thompson's request," David explained calmly. "As the individual most directly affected by the circumstances underlying this case, I believe my perspective may be relevant." The committee exchanged glances but ultimately allowed both Harold and David to remain. The formal review proceeded methodically, with each committee member questioning Michael about his decisions during both emergency surgeries and the subsequent care of his grandparents. When the questioning concluded, Harold asked permission to speak. His voice, once demanding and authoritative in this same room, was now measured and reflective. When I first learned that Dr. Johnson was my grandson, I reacted with anger and fear, he began. I was determined to punish him for what I perceived as professional misconduct. The truth, which I'm not proud to admit, is that I was afraid of being vulnerable, of being seen clearly by the grandson I had rejected before his birth. The committee members shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about the personal turn the hearing had taken. Harold continued, undeterred. Dr. Johnson made exactly the right medical decisions in an impossible situation. Had he not performed those surgeries when he did, I would not be alive today. His actions were guided by medical necessity and professional ethics of the highest order. David's testimony followed, equally measured and impactful. He spoke of Michael's integrity in reaching out, of the healing that had begun for multiple families because of his courage, and of the profound medical skill that had saved Harold's life twice. If your concern is whether Dr. Johnson can make sound medical judgments involving family members, I submit that he has already proven that he can, David concluded. He has demonstrated the rare ability to maintain professional standards, even under extraordinary personal pressure. The committee deliberated for less than 20 minutes before rendering their decision. Michael would be completely exonerated, the formal warning removed from his file, and the matter considered closed. Outside the hospital, the three men stood together in the weak spring sunshine, an improbable trio connected by circumstance and choice rather than simple genetics. "Thank you," Michael said simply, looking between Harold and David. "Both of you." Harold nodded, uncharacteristically humble. "It was the least I could do." That evening, a celebratory dinner was organized at Emma and Marcus's home. The table, extended to its full length, accommodated not only the immediate family but also David and his wife Sarah, who had been quietly supportive throughout the entire extraordinary process. Emma had prepared all of Michael's favorite foods, the table laden with dishes that marked special occasions throughout his childhood. As they gathered around, the atmosphere was lighter than it had been in months. The shared relief of the Ethics Committee's decision, combined with Harold's improving health, creating a genuine sense of celebration. As Marcus raised his glass in a toast to Michael's vindication, Harold cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him, conversation falling away. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice steady. "I've decided to make a significant donation to the community center. The board has approved the creation of a scholarship program in the name of the Thompson-Johnson family, specifically for young people who have overcome trauma or adversity." Silence greeted this revelation, broken only when Emma asked quietly, "Why now, Dad?" Harold's eyes, when they met his daughter's, held a clarity that had been missing for decades. "Because I finally understand that atonement isn't about punishment. It's about creating something meaningful from the damage you've caused." Later that night, as Michael helped clear away the dishes, he found the photo frame that had sat on his mother's desk for years, Emma and Marcus on their wedding day, the visible absence of her parents, a silent testimony to the family fracture. Beside it now stood a new photo, taken earlier that evening. 3 generations of the Thompson-Johnson family, together with David Wilson and his wife, all gathered around the dining table. That night, while helping Harold sort through some old belongings, Michael found an antique picture frame hidden in his grandfather's box of personal items. Inside was a torn and carefully mended photo of Emma pregnant, proving that even during the darkest years, Harold had never completely stopped thinking about the daughter and grandson he didn't know. Michael carefully placed the mended photograph back in its frame, a tangible piece of evidence that Harold had never completely severed himself from his family, even during the darkest years. The torn edges, meticulously taped together, spoke of a private ritual, Perhaps Harold taking out the forbidden image late at night, studying the daughter he'd banished and the unborn grandson he would never know. The discovery softened something in Michael, a final piece of understanding slotting into place. 6 months later, the Thompson family gathered on a sun-drenched afternoon to celebrate the completion of Harold and Judith's new home. Situated just 2 blocks from Emma and Marcus's house, the single-story brick bungalow represented more than just a change of address. It was a physical manifestation of their commitment to rebuilding family connections. Michael pulled into the driveway, his hospital badge still clipped to his shirt pocket. The promotion to chief resident had come through 3 weeks earlier, bringing additional responsibilities that frequently extended his shifts. Still, he'd made it clear to the hospital administration that family obligations now held equal priority in his life, a boundary he might never have established before the events of the past year. "You're late," Emma called from the porch, though her smile removed any sting from the observation. "Your father's already fired up the grill, and Judith's been asking for you." Michael embraced his mother, noticing how much more relaxed she seemed these days. The rigid posture that had once signaled her vigilance against old wounds had softened, her movements more fluid, her laughter coming more easily. "Surgery ran long," he explained, following her into the house. "But I wouldn't miss this for anything." Inside, the home hummed with the familiar chaos of family gathering. Judith directed the arrangement of furniture with gentle authority, while Harold, still thinner than before his hospitalizations but with healthy color in his cheeks, hung framed photographs along the hallway. The careful inclusion of images spanning all eras of family history, including those decades-long gaps, represented a deliberate choice to acknowledge both joyful and painful chapters. "There's my favorite doctor," Harold said, turning from his task to embrace his grandson. The easy physical affection between them would have been unimaginable months earlier. "Just in time to tell me if this frame is level." Michael adjusted the picture slightly, recognizing it as a recent shot of the whole family at the community center's fundraising event. "Perfect now," he confirmed. The doorbell announced new arrivals, neighbors bringing welcome gifts, colleagues from the hospital, and finally, David Wilson and his family. Their integration into the extended Thompson-Johnson circle had progressed naturally, weekly dinners and shared holidays, gradually normalizing what had once seemed an impossible connection. "The place looks wonderful," David commented, wheeling himself through the specially designed wide doorways, a feature Harold had insisted on during renovation. "Sarah sent these along." He handed over a pot of flowering plants, their vibrant blooms matching the cheerful atmosphere of the gathering. As the house filled with guests, Michael observed the interactions with quiet satisfaction. His colleagues from the hospital mingled with Harold's new friends from the community center, while Emma and Judith moved through the crowd together, their synchronicity suggesting they were making up for lost years of mother-daughter companionship. "Quite the transformation," Claire remarked, appearing at Michael's elbow with 2 glasses of punch. "From operating on strangers who turned out to be relatives to this." She gestured to the scene around them. "If someone had described this outcome to you a year ago, would you have believed it?" Michael accepted the drink gratefully. "Not for a second. I'd have questioned their grasp on reality." In the backyard, Marcus had taken charge of the grill, entertaining a cluster of guests with a story about his recent anthropological research trip. His deep laugh carried across the garden, punctuating whatever punchline he had just delivered. Watching him, Michael was struck by his father's generosity of spirit. The capacity to welcome Harold into his home after decades of rejection showed a remarkable absence of bitterness. As evening approached, Harold called for everyone's attention, tapping a spoon against his glass. The gathering quieted, all eyes turning toward the elderly man who stood straighter now than he had in years, unburdened by the secret that had bent his shoulders for so long. "I want to thank all of you for being here today," Harold began, his voice strong despite his age. "Especially my family. who have given me a second chance I never expected to receive." He paused, eyes moving across the faces before him. "Many of you know that our family has come full circle in ways that seemed impossible just a year ago." Harold's gaze settled on David, who nodded slightly in acknowledgement of their shared history. "When I thought my life was ending, it was actually beginning again. That's something I've learned from the young people at the center. It's never too late to change your path." A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. Harold continued, "Which brings me to an announcement. The board of directors at the community center has accepted my proposal for a substantial donation to expand their programs. Starting next month, the Thompson Johnson Scholarship will provide educational support for young people who have overcome significant trauma or adversity." The news was met with enthusiastic applause. Michael caught his mother's eye across the room, noting the complex emotions playing across her face. Pride mingled with lingering traces of old pain, all gradually resolving into acceptance. As conversations resumed around them, Emma approached her father, touching his arm lightly. "I have news of my own," she said, her voice just loud enough for the immediate family to hear. "I've started writing a book about our experience, about reconciliation and second chances." She hesitated before adding, "I'm calling it The Bridge Over the Abyss." Harold's eyes widened, a moment of apprehension quickly replaced by understanding. "That's appropriate," he acknowledged. "Will you let me read it when you're ready?" "You'll be my first reader," Emma promised. As twilight settled over the gathering, Harold guided everyone to the garden where a surprise awaited. Materials had been arranged near the small decorative pond: wood, stone, metal pieces, and tools. "Judith and I thought it would be meaningful if we all built something together," Harold explained. "A bridge for the garden, something symbolic of what we've accomplished as a family." The project brought everyone together in unexpected ways. Marcus and Harold worked side by side, their conversation flowing more naturally than ever before as they measured and cut wood. Emma and Judith arranged the decorative stones that would form the pathway to the bridge, while Michael assisted David with the assembly of the metal railings, designed to be both beautiful and functional. "He seems genuinely happy," David observed quietly, nodding toward Harold as they worked. "I never expected that outcome when I showed up at your door that day." "None of us did," Michael agreed, securing a decorative panel. "I think he's finally allowing himself to be the person he might have been without the weight of that secret." As darkness fell, outdoor lights illuminated the completed bridge, modest in size but meaningful in its craftsmanship. Each family member had contributed something to its construction, creating a structure that was literally the sum of their collective efforts. "It's beautiful," Judith declared, her arm linked through Emma's as they admired their work. "And sturdy," Marcus added with professional approval. "This bridge will last." The gathering gradually dispersed as the hour grew late, guests departing with warm embraces and promises of future visits. Michael helped his parents gather leftover food while Harold and Judith said their goodbyes at the door. "Will you stay a bit longer?" Judith asked Michael when the last guest had gone. "I found some albums from my side of the family I thought you might like to see." They settled in the new living room, surrounded by the warmth of fresh beginnings. As Judith showed Michael childhood photos of relatives he'd never known existed, he was struck by how quickly this had come to feel normal, this connection to his past, to people who shared his features and mannerisms. "You know," Emma remarked, joining them with cups of tea, "most people grow up knowing their grandparents from birth. Leave it to our family to do everything backwards." Their laughter was interrupted by the ring of Michael's phone. He checked the screen, his expression immediately shifting to professional focus. "It's the hospital," he explained, rising from his seat. "Emergency involving a car accident. 3 generations of the same family brought in together." Harold nodded in understanding, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Go," he said simply. "We'll be here when you get back." At the door, Michael paused, looking back at the tableau of his family. His mother and father, his grandparents, all gathered in a home that hadn't existed 6 months ago, beneath a roof that now sheltered reconciliation instead of estrangement. As he drove toward the hospital, Michael's mind was already shifting to the emergency that awaited him, but a part of him remained aware of the profound symmetry of the moment. His phone rang again, the hospital calling with preliminary details about the incoming patients. He answered with confidence, a slight smile playing at his lips, knowing exactly the importance of what he was about to do.